Please let me know if you can hear me okay, if I need to change anything. So this is all live. So here we go. Before we start the webinar about the introduction, let me introduce myself. My name is Kevin Heinz. I am the managing editor and content manager at Wordvice. And as you may know, because you've registered for this webinar, or maybe you haven't, we are an international editing company. So we're putting out this webinar to give you as much help on writing your research paper as possible. And hopefully that when you are finished writing your manuscript, your dissertation, whatever, you can send it to us. And I want to tell you a little bit about our services. So as I mentioned, we are Wordvice Editing Services. You can visit our webpage here at wordvice.com. We handle research papers, dissertations, some manuscripts for submission to all kinds of journals. We've had thousands and thousands of our clients get accepted into prestigious journals. We do submissions, cover letters, and a host of other academic documents. So if you are interested in editing services, please check us out. If you want more resources like this webinar, we have videos and blogs at our resources page, which you can find here. And for all of the materials I'll be presenting today, I've included links in the description box below. So if you're curious about where you can find a certain paper or a certain link for whatever we talk about today, you can find that in the description box. Okay, so let's get started, shall we? Oh, it's 4 now. Maybe we can wait another minute. Why don't you go ahead and write on the right-hand side if you're able to? I'm not sure if anybody is able to chat, so tell us where you're coming from. I know we have a lot of people from Turkey joining us for this webinar, and Japan, Korea, Taiwan, US, so there should be people from all over the world interested in writing research papers. So if you don't mind, leave a message, whatever it is. There's only 20 of us right now, so it's not a huge community yet. Let's make sure we got this on straight. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the introduction, so I think I can go ahead and get started. A few of the things that I talk about will be repeated a few times in this webinar. But if you're just joining us, I want to let you know that this is provided by Wordvice Editing Services. And if you register for this webinar, we're going to give you 10% discount on any editing paper that you submit. So if you're your first paper. And we also will provide you with a PDF for all the materials. So I have included a link to the order, I believe, or perhaps not. Yeah, if you are wondering where you can find the registration, you can go to wordvice.com and go to this link right here. You can just click right on it, and it will take you to a registration page. You can include your number, your name, and your email address, and a few other pieces of information, and you will be registered, and you can receive that discount. And we'll send a PDF to your email. And just so you know, you can go ahead and register up to 3 or 4 days later, and you can still get that discount. So if you are wondering, you still have some time to register. Okay. So I want to begin this webinar by giving you the content, what we're going to talk about today. The lecture is a really, really important part of every research paper, and it contains a lot of information. So I want to go step by step and show you what each section, which each part of the introduction does. So first we're going to talk about what the introduction is for, what it does. Then we're going to go into structure and which information you should include. That includes background information, statement of purpose, and the literature that you should include. We'll also talk a little bit about pre-writing, not too much, just we'll show you how to turn your purpose statement into more comprehensive context that you can use for background. We'll also be looking at some sample introduction sections from real papers, and we'll have a frequently asked question as well as do's and don'ts, and finally a QA session. But as I mentioned, if you have questions at any time, feel free to go ahead and type your question in on the right hand side, and I'll try to answer it for you. Okay, so let's get started. So if you haven't written a research paper before, you might be wondering what exactly the introduction section does. And as with any introduction, it introduces the paper. So in the case of a research paper, you need to establish the context of the study that you're writing about. And the context has multiple parts. So you want to let the reader know where the research fits into the current science, especially in that particular area. So if you're writing about biochemistry or genetics or a very narrow field, you want to let the reader know how your study contributes to this field. You also provide some background and further context. In context, when you see this word, it means literature, it means knowledge. So we're going to talk a lot about literature and how to put the literature of research into your introduction. Primary literature and citations. Okay, so you're going to add a lot of citations in this section. The introduction section also states the purpose of the work in the form of a hypothesis, a question, or a problem that's being investigated. And if you're working on research papers, it's likely that you know what a hypothesis is and you know what a purpose statement is, but you might not know exactly how to construct that. So we're going to show you. You'll include motivations for doing the study. You'll explain what the objectives and the aims are in detail, which will later be shown in the discussion section. And finally, you're going to give a rationale for your approach, a brief rationale for why you did the study in this particular way, as opposed to other studies, or as opposed to choosing a different model or a different experimental structure. You will talk about the merits or reasons for a particular experiment or model. You will explain and defend your approach for answering the research question. Why did you do the study the way you did? But this does not mean that you will include methods. So if you're talking about how you studied a particular kind of cancer, you're not going to talk about how the study was structured in terms of methods or analysis or anything like that. And we'll show you how to do that. So first, let's talk about structure and where the introduction fits in. So most journals require research papers to use IMRD or IMRAD, and that is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Now, every journal has its own standards for what they want papers to, the structure that they want papers to use, but this is the gold standard, right? So about 10 to 20% of your research paper is actually included in the introduction. This is a very rough guideline. Every journal will have its own standards, and you can really tell, I'll say this again and again and again, you really need to look at the target journal and the articles in that journal to find out how long your introduction should be, what percentage of the paper. But generally speaking, the longer your paper, the more room you have for introduction, the more you need to explain the background, previous studies, and the context for your research. Okay, so if you think about the introduction, or if you think about your study, that is, as filling a gap in knowledge, then that is a really good way to think about what the introduction does. It explains how your study fills a particular gap in knowledge. So the main content that you will discuss later in the results, and especially the discussion, should already be mentioned or already be familiar in the introduction. Not the details of the results, but the aim. What exactly is your study dealing with? What are the key ideas, the key variables, etc. You also want to write the introduction last. So as a matter of preparing, you don't write the introduction as if you're writing a letter to a friend, right? It's not like a greeting. You want to make sure that you write it even after the discussion, because you want to make sure you've included everything that will be introduced later in the discussion. So you're just going to make sure that you're as complete as possible by writing it last. That is also before the abstract. So the abstract is last, but introduction is the final part of the IMRD section. Okay, your introduction must answer two main questions. That is, what is the gap in knowledge that currently exists and why does it need filling? So this is the importance of your study. You're going to talk about motivations for the study and what's missing from previous studies. And how does this study fill that gap? What is the role in filling that missing information? So I like this metaphor of a puzzle because it's very simple and easy to understand. And you can see we have all the pieces that are connected is what is currently known, and the missing piece is what is unknown. So this is the gap that you're going to fill. So if you always think about your study as a puzzle, then you can approach the introduction as a way of explaining what this missing information is and how generally your study will fill that missing puzzle piece. Okay, here's just an overview of information that you should include. So you'll include different kinds of information that contributes to context. That is a lot of literature. Literature, of course, is not like books and novels, but it is the previous scientific studies that created the foundation on which your study is rested and which your research is based. You'll also talk about current knowledge, more up-to-date studies. So current studies are, if they've been peer-reviewed, they are actually generally better to use than older studies because they're going to be more up-to-date. Talking about your approach, the rationale for your approach, and hypothesis. Again, I told you I would repeat a lot of things. This is just so if you have these questions, you'll be able to see these in the materials. Since your introduction is 10 to 20% maximum of your paper, you don't want to spend 90% of that time on only one kind of information. You need to make sure there's a balance between the context, the hypothesis, the rationale. It's all important. A lot of reasons, a big reason why manuscripts are rejected is because in the introduction section there's something missing. And so you need to really check these boxes and make sure you have everything there. So you don't want to include too many sources. If you have too much irrelevant information, so you want to explain the history of horticulture, it's not a good idea because it's not important to your study and it also distracts from the focus of your study, which is your purpose statement. So let's break down the information a little bit more. And this is a little bit of the order that you will present these items. So you have background information about the topic, the motivations for undertaking this study, why you want to fill the gap. And this could be what's missing in the scientific community or in the particular area of research, but also what motivations do you have through this study for for filling a wider societal gap or fixing a problem in society or in another sector of society, for example, healthcare or cancer research. In key primary literature works, almost all of your introduction is literature. Let's put it this way. You're going to use the studies that you're reading and put them into your own words, but the literature is what is cited and sits underneath the statements that you make, the evidence that you bring in the introduction. And you'll see what I mean a little bit later. The hypothesis and the research question, the problem statement, and the approaches that you took in the study. Again, you don't want to include the methods here, and we'll show you how those two differentiate. And last, if you have expected outcomes to your hypothesis, you can elaborate on your hypothesis and talk about what you expected. It's not generally necessary, but again, depending on the journal, you can see that from time to time. Okay, so the structure of the introduction, if you've seen our video on YouTube, you can check it out on how to write the introduction section. You might recognize this diagram. So the introduction is an inverted triangle shape. That is, it goes from the broadest information to the narrowest, to the most specific. So the most general information to the most detailed problem statement and purpose. So you start with the general aspects of the topic, such as the past literature or foundational research that is fairly well known or well established. Don't spend too much time on that. And then you will move into more specific topical data or information that provides context that's closely related to your study. And finally, you will talk about your hypothesis or your purpose statement and your rationale. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to create context from a hypothesis. Before you even start writing your paper, you should know what your statement of purpose is. You know what the paper is about, what the paper is doing exactly. So you should make sure and create that specific purpose statement first. And from there, you can ask some questions to gain an idea of what you need to write about in terms of literature, what context you should include. Okay, so once you know the context, you will know better what level and type of general information, or I should say primary research to begin with, to include. All right, so let's look at an example here. So this is supposed to be a purpose statement. The purpose of this study was to assess the value of dosimetric data for 23 recurrent pancreatic cancer patients re-irradiated with whole gland external beam radiotherapy. Okay, so in the bolded sections, these are the keywords, what I take to be the keywords of the study. And you can form your questions to establish context, to choose which studies to include in the literature based on those key central ideas. So here's some questions I asked from this study. These are my questions I would ask if I was going to get on and research PubMed or whatever database to find studies. For example, what is the optimal management strategy for recurrent pancreatic cancer? Since recurrent pancreatic cancer is a central part of this title of this study. What is the efficacy of irradiation with whole beam EBRT? Well, this is another central element of the study, so you want to search studies that have this language or this element in them, and then you can discuss what those studies found out. Is there a competing form of radiation therapy to contend with this procedure? And when you discuss your rationale to your approach, here you could say, you could either use that theory to support your study, or if it undermines your study or goes against your study, you can provide counter argument to that study and say why your study is more robust, or why it's more legitimate, why it's novel, what is good about it. So you don't want to leave out that information if it's in the literature. You want to confront it and use it, and that will really strengthen your paper. What are the dosimetric data for related studies? Okay, so again, just related studies. Find the most relevant literature based on keywords. And that's all I have to say about pre-writing. The rest will be about looking at real examples and detailed information. So let's talk about the flow of the introduction. The first thing you will do is to clearly identify the subject area and the topic. And we mentioned keywords. You're going to use the keywords here because readers want to know what is the focus of the paper. So use keywords from the title in the first sentence or two or three or four of your introduction. This really depends how long your paper is, therefore how long your introduction is. Some introductions don't use keywords right away because they are very big studies, or they're long, so they can use more background. They don't have to attack from the first sentence or two to get the reader's attention and say, this is my focus. But if your study is shorter, you should consider doing that. Consider using the keywords to establish your focus. So here's an example. Title is EGA8, Evolutionary Genetics Modeling version 8.0 for larger data sets. So some keywords below the abstract might be evolutionary genetics modeling and data sets. I'm not sure if those were the keywords, but anyway, the first two lines of this introduction go like this. Evolutionary genetic modeling. I wrote the keywords in red, by the way. Evolutionary genetic modeling software can now be applied to increasingly larger data sets. And we have a citation, which you won't see that often. You'll see usually a lot more group citations, depending on how many references you're using. This requires an advanced algorithm of the computation core and the user interface of EGA. So right away, here's evidence. In the first sentence, they're using these keywords that are in their title. Okay, here's an example from a real article that I pulled from the Public Library of Science. And before we go further, I want to just pull this up, actually. So the Public Library of Science. I got a lot of my the examples I'll be showing here today from this website. The Public Library of Science is a free, open source, and free to use. Of course, you must cite everything that you use or publish, but it's very handy for looking at examples of what introductions should be or other parts of the research paper. It's a really good resource, so I recommend it. So from this resource, I found this article. And the title is Targeted Therapy Database, TTD, a model to match patients' molecular profile with current knowledge on cancer biology. So the keywords that were under the abstract here were targeted therapy, early diagnosis, molecular profile, and cancer biology. So let's see how the author did in including those keywords. So I've highlighted them here. In the first paragraph, they've used cancer, early diagnosis, anti-cancer treatments, molecular target therapies. But they've also, this is quite a long article. So you can see how there's a lot of space explaining the wider background. Cancer represents the third leading cause of death worldwide. They've established their motivation right away. Like, why is this study important? Well, first of all, cancer is killing people, and obviously that's why it's important. And even in this general statistic, I guess, they give two sources. They don't. The author, and you'll see this from other examples, the author doesn't have to use the names of the researchers or the study. They don't have to say, in Johnson and Maynard, 1995, it is proven that cancer represents the third leading cause of death worldwide. That takes up a lot more room. So rather than that, it's better to put it in your own words. Put the fact, the statement in your own words, and then include the citation that supports that fact. And they've done the same down here too. There's no quotes, right? General agreement exists regarding the urgency of developing yada yada yada. This general agreement is established by these studies. So there's not a ton of details there. It's like if you want to know more, click on these studies and research for yourself. Okay. So the second thing you want to do is establish the context. Talk a bit more about what is known. So we could talk all day about literature background information, but the thing you want to be aware of is that you should be concise and accurate in your review. I mean, you don't want to be using information that's not relevant or that's, of course, not accurate when you're discussing the literature. But it should be as close to your study as possible that provides useful information for researchers. Okay, so we don't have to go through all these. Let's just say, summarize what researchers knew about the problem before the study. Okay, that's the key. What is known before? How does your study improve upon it? Move from big picture to very narrow. Same movement that we have with the overall introduction, from larger to more narrowed and focused. Define the key terms used. You don't always need to define the terms in an encyclopedic way, or a dictionary way. You can actually define the terms in the context of the study or the area as well. And you'll see that that can be very important in focusing further on your key central terms. Give a general review of primary research. All right. Sometimes you'll have, this general is important too. Sometimes you'll have studies that are very closely related to your study and you want to focus on those studies. Then you can talk a little bit more about those studies in particular. But the general is where you start in this part of the introduction. And read a lot of articles to see which kinds of details should be included. Always read a lot of articles in your target journals. Okay, let's look at the real article example. At the beginning of the second paragraph, this author begins to use primary research to create context. Let's see how they do it. This is from an actual article. The term targeted therapy includes all those approaches that aim to tailor the therapy to the patient or cohort of patients, ... Okay, so two things I want you to notice here. This author, it kind of reads like a dictionary, as they have given the term first and then they described what it does. But they haven't, note that they haven't just said targeted therapy is defined by as approaches that aim to tailor the therapy. You know, they're saying this is the limitations, or this is what it encompasses. The term targeted therapy encompasses these approaches. And the second thing is a little bit more basic, but it's important in formatting, is that they use quotation marks. So you're not really supposed to define terms in the abstract. So the introduction is where you define these terms. And it's important to use quotation marks when not only to draw attention to the term, but if it's a context-specific term. If it means something different in this context, it's good to use quotations the first time that you write it. So keep that in mind from just a formatting and style point of view. And again, you see they've used 8 citations here just for this. What does targeted therapy include? Well, all these studies talk about that, right? To a greater or lesser degree. Okay, and in this second part, what has the author done? Oh, so they have discussed, they're talking now not about the, not defining the term, but talking about what has targeted therapy accomplished. It has made several advances. A number of smart approaches have now reached the clinical phase. So they're bringing the reader up to where we are now with what targeted therapy has accomplished. So first, what is it? What does it include? Second, what is where is it now? Why is it important? And yeah, there's even more studies cited here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 studies, right? So a lot of studies show what targeted therapy is doing now. So later in this introduction, you'll see the author show how their research is important because of what these previous studies haven't focused on yet. Okay, primary literature. Which primary literature should you cite? Let's go quickly through these. It should be obvious. Original research articles. Don't use general background references because they're too fundamental or common knowledge. So don't use Do not use textbooks, lab manuals, style manuals, encyclopedias. They're not going to be up to date either. So primary research is what you want to focus on. Okay, so this is a helpful tool. A citation index will help you locate articles that are not only more recent, but also more relevant. And that includes, there's a lot of them, but these are big ones. Web of Science, Scopus, CiteSeer, and Google Scholar. And you can find links to all of these in the description below, so please use those. And here's some more domain-specific indexes, examples. Inspire, HEP, PubMed, all of the links are below. So if you're a researcher in the area of high energy physics or life sciences and biomedical, check out some of these. And astrophysics data system is a Harvard index, so it's actually highly trusted too. So feel free to use those sources. Review articles are also very useful because they contain tons of information on a narrow subject, and you can see what has been done from this year to this year. So use review articles when you're researching your literature, even before you've done your study. As for the number of sources, in average, a good amount for a 10 to 15 page paper, maybe 5 to 8 sources. So, I mean, this is a minimum. You could use a lot more sources. The answer to that question depends on how much literature there is, how much you find. It's not a race. It's not like the more literature you have, the better always, but just the more relevant literature you have, the more your study can be supported and grounded in foundational studies. Present supporting evidence to back up your argument, but don't include peripheral articles. You should cite all of the sources listed in the references section. So you shouldn't have any sources, any references that you didn't use in your paper. Like, oh, I looked at this website, but I didn't write about it. Or I read this study, but I didn't include it in my paper. Just don't include it in the references. Okay, how many sources should you cite? Well, again, that really depends on many factors, but in our targeted therapy database article, it cites 56 sources, and 50 of them are included in the introduction section. So this is fairly common. Most of your sources will be included in the introduction. The remainder are likely in the discussion. There may be some in methods because it refers to previous methods as well. But you can mention those in the introduction. As I said earlier, once you mention them in the introduction, you introduce them, later you can go into greater detail. So you should have, the majority of your sources should be used in the introduction. Okay, read the relevant literature before doing the study to understand the most current knowledge. That goes without saying. Okay, figures and tables. I'm going to skip this just as a matter of time and because generally speaking, you don't need figures in the introduction. That's all I'll tell you there. Okay, don't use figures in the introduction unless the journal that you're submitting to uses that as a standard. Okay, so next, in line with your introduction, you will describe what your study does. State the purpose or hypothesis. So when I write purpose statement or statement of purpose, this is the very short 1 sentence, maybe 2 sentences statement of what your study is going to figure out, what it's going to do. It is the most critical piece of information in the introduction. It's at the tip of the inverted triangle. So here's some things you want to keep in mind. You want to use a clear form phrase to introduce it. If you're not familiar with how to write the purpose, it's very easy because you can always write it like this. The purpose of the study was to assess ABC. We investigated 2 possible mechanisms to explain the. Okay, so these are 2 ways. You can write the purpose of the study was to, and whatever the purpose, or what you did. So instead of investigated, you might say we laid out, we presented, we analyzed, but generally the introduction will use present tense when you're describing the purpose because you're talking about the content of the study. So for example, you might say the purpose of this study was to investigate the reasons for XYZ. The purpose was to analyze these two variables. The purpose was to assess the impact of something, to measure the amount of something, etc. Okay, so you can use this language. It's very, very common in every journal. Do not include the terms hypothesis or null hypothesis. You don't have to say usually you can see it though, but you don't have to use the term hypothesis. It should be obvious from your explanation. Your hypothesis is a testable statement that's making a prediction about something, so you don't have to say the word hypothesis usually. A statement of purpose or hypothesis is placed near the end of the introduction, and it's often the topic sentence of the final paragraph. So if you're wondering about, I don't talk much about this in this webinar, but the introduction is not one giant paragraph. It's split into several paragraphs usually. And the way to do that is sort of how we are doing it in this flow of the introduction. You want to separate the sections by what they do. So you probably would want to put the purpose statement in its own paragraph. It's more visible that way. It's easier for the readers to see what the purpose is. And then after that, you can discuss your approaches and why you took those approaches. Okay, so there's two overall kinds of purpose statements, the qualitative and the quantitative. The research question in these narrow the purpose down to a specific question for the researcher to find answers. So either one does the same thing. However, they're slightly different. The quantitative has independent variables that are objective and can be put directly into numbers. They use statistical, mathematical, computational techniques. And you know right away when you see quantitative because it has numbers or measurements that are easy to just take and plug in as a variable. The purpose of this study is to determine the average height and weight of high school students in New York public schools. So which of these variables are measurable, quantifiable? Well, height and weight. Okay, there's a measurable number. Qualitative, the independent variables are are subjective and cannot be put directly into numbers. So for example, the purpose of this study is to determine the satisfaction rate of high school students. Satisfaction rate is, you can eventually quantify these by analyzing them. So your methods can make this quantifiable, but the answer to the question, are you happy, or what makes you happy, is not something that is exactly quantitative, or a measure of happiness, that is. So these are just two kinds of purpose statements. Okay, so let's look at an actual article statement of purpose. So the two statements of purpose this is a description of these statements of purpose. This article actually has two statements of purpose because it has two areas of focus, and that's fairly unusual, but they serve as a good example for how even in one paper there can be, it's basically like two studies in the same paper under two headings. So the first heading is targeted therapy in cancer medicine, and the second area of focus is the specific case of melanoma. Okay, so the first purpose statement under targeted therapy goes like this. The objective of the present project is to, and then you can read through this statement as well, but I just want to show you that this structure, this formal language to clarify the purpose statement is almost always used. So don't be afraid to kind of copy and paste this part of it and put in your own focus, your own purpose, what your study accomplishes. All right, in the second heading, subheading, under the case of melanoma, here's the purpose statement. This essay describes the main features of newly implemented database. Right? So both of these are at the beginning of the paragraph as well. And the final paragraph is rather short because it only contains the purpose statement and then the rationale for the approach, which is what we will talk about now. So in the last part, this is the final section that we will talk about. In the discussion of your approach, you are going to talk about not only the aim, but also the reasons for why you chose to take this route or this route. Why did you study this kind of plant or this kind of cancer? What is different about your overall model or experiment structure that makes it better? It does a better job of answering questions than previous studies. So it's a rationale, it's a reason. So it usually follows the purpose statement in the last paragraph of the introduction. It comes right after the purpose statement. So here's some questions you can ask yourself and then answer in the rationale. So if your question was, why did you choose this kind of approach or experimental design? In your rationale, you could say, we chose this design because, and then give your reason. So you can make that rationale as clear as your actual statement of purpose too. What are the merits of this particular modal system? So in answering that, how can you answer that? How can you make that a statement? The merits of this particular modal system are ... What advantages does it present in answering that particular question? As a statement, the advantages of this mode of investigation are ABC. Right? So these are ways of explaining yourself. Why did you do it this way and not the other way? Why is your study more effective or robust than other studies? Here you're not going to discuss the specific techniques or modes of analysis in your study. So again, those are the methods. You might not catch that you're adding methods. Many authors, once they write their papers, might not see that they are missing portions of the introduction or spending too much time on one part or another, or including incorrect information. So this is where peer review can come in handy. Your peer can tell you, this maybe should be changed, and move to the methods. So you should get some help in analyzing that. Especially if you're using a novel or highly unusual technique or methodology, you can discuss the merits of the approach versus previously used methods. That's a good way to sort of sell your study. Why is your study so great? What is your study doing? So this is why journals want to accept studies, because they are important. They are new, novel. They're unusual. They're eye-catching. So not only is the study, it should be well conducted. Everything should be, what's the term I'm looking for? Everything should be legitimate, and there should be no errors or ethical issues or anything of that nature. But also it should be interesting for the readership of the journal, and it should catch people's eye. So you can explain that in the rationale. Okay. Here's some examples. If the hypothesis is the study assessed whether a zygomycota absorbed water mainly through the cell wall or through other mechanisms of the mycelia, right? These are this is not the actual article, so it's been filtered through my non-biologist brain. So if you're a biologist, please forgive me for the content of this section. But anyway, you'll get the point. The approach, the rationale for your approach, you could say, whereas previous studies of zygomycota fungi focused on osmosis through cell walls, this study measured moisture absorption by other parts of the mycelia. So the reason for this rationale is it's a different approach than before. What makes it different? And you can use this kind of language, whereas in the past, this was the case. In my study, in my study, this is the case. So this is a kind of template language you can use too in the red. Okay, let's look at one more. In the purpose statement, the author writes, the purpose of this study was to assess the prognosis for individuals with the rare chromosomal disorder XF152 and determine associated risk factors. So let's see what they do in their approach. Is it going to be differentiating it? Is it going to be stressing the importance of the study? Well, you can tell right away they give due to, okay, because, so there's a condition. Due to the rarity of this disorder, because this disorder is rare, finding sample groups in a single country would yield insufficient results. Thus, this study was carried out by cooperative teams in 7 countries. So the rationale here is for doing the study in this maybe unorthodox or novel way is the sampling requirements. And you might be wondering, like, how is this not the methods? Because we're talking about how the study was conducted. That's the methods, right? Well, if this author were to go into greater detail, it could be considered methods, but this is like the overall approach of the entire study. So, and it's also interesting that it's an international study and there's different teams. So right away, the author gets a chance to defend that or explain that in the introduction, but not go into detail. Okay, let's look at some more, because this can be difficult to give a very short rationale sometimes. If the hypothesis is, given the described protective role of caffeine and its association with mitochondria, we hypothesize that a common denominator exists in endothelial cells, cardiomyocytes, and cardiac fibroblasts that improve the mitochondria-dependent functionalities of those cells in vivo, ex vivo, and in vivo. Okay. So the rationale, just pay attention to the red mostly. Since the role of non-nuclear P27 in non-tumor cells was never examined in detail, you can tell by the first clause, it's not a full sentence, right? It's a dependent clause, but it already sets up why you did it, right? So actually this is a kind of a clever way to write the rationale. If it was written, if the clauses were reversed and you had, we investigated whether P27 is present in the mitochondria and is indeed required, etc., because the role of non-nuclear P27. If you have those switched, it's harder to see the rationale, right? But if you start with this language, because, since, you can right away, you can see the flaw in, or the missing element of the previous study. Later on, which would prevent a new mode of action for caffeine, explaining its protective function in the cardiovascular system. So there's 2 rationales here. The first one is to account for this lack of examination of this non-nuclear P27. And the second rationale is to lead to action to explain caffeine's function. So it's a kind of a wider implication. So this is actually, the rationale can actually be implication. You're hinting at implications. This is the sort of content you'll see later in the discussion section when you go into detail about the implications and why the study, what exactly the study might impact in other fields or in that field. Okay, let's look at one more because these are very illustrative. Okay, statement of purpose. The objective of this present project is to create a manually annotated database where the relative data are gathered in formal representation. Let's move on. So this is, to this aim, we focused on melanoma. I highlighted this because it's not exactly giving the rationale as in the previous one. It's not, since it's not giving a reason, sorry about that, it's not giving a reason why this previous studies weren't effective or deep enough, but it is giving a reason. It is connecting the approach to the purpose. It took me a long time to say, but let's see if we can unpack that. To this aim, we focus on melanoma, an increasingly diagnosed malignancy for which there is an urgent need to develop novel therapeutic approaches since no effective treatment is available, especially in the advanced setting. So the aim here is to create a manually annotated database, and they used melanoma to do that. And why did they use melanoma? Well, because there is an urgent need to develop therapy for this type of cancer. So the rationale here explains the focus on melanoma specifically over other cancers, and it further clarifies what the aim, what the purpose of this study is. Okay, and the last ones, I believe. So this is the second subheading of the therapeutic targeting article. Targeting therapy. This essay describes the main features of a newly implemented MMP database called Targeted Therapy Database, comma. So this is in the same sentence, continues, which specifically focuses on the available scientific information that can be exploited to promote the development of personalized treatments. Right, so as a rationale, this is just, it's kind of like clarifying what this targeted therapy database is good for, right? So it's clarifying the importance of this database. And later, it's explaining the direct impact on individual patients, right? Promote the development of personalized treatments for patients. It's expanding the implications to a wider context and really accenting and highlighting the importance of this particular approach. You may be asking then, how do you choose the right rationale? And that can be tricky. It's a function of reading enough literature to find out what's missing, why your study is important. And let me go back to those questions we asked a few pages ago, right? Why did you choose this approach? What are the merits of this design? Keep these questions in mind as you read the literature and compare them to your study, and you might find a good reason why your approach is better. And write down as much about the rationale as possible so that later you can reduce that to a 1, 2, or 3 sentence rationale. Okay. All right, so we are through with the parts of the introduction section. Let's quickly just go through some FAQ. So we talked about this. When should I write the introduction section? Write it second to last. I said last before, but that's with the caveat of the conclusion. You know, so not all articles have conclusions. Often there's just a discussion section. But at least write it after the methods, results, and the discussion. If you have a very brief conclusion, you can write that last. But generally speaking, introduction, write it last so you don't miss anything. Should I use the present or the past tense? That's a good question, and I don't want to lead you astray by telling you that there is only one way to do it. Read the journal articles, but here's some rough guidelines. For the literature review, or discussing the literature, that is, usually you will use the past tense when discussing the actions of researchers. So you could talk about Thompson and James when you're talking about what they did with their methods. But then again, you're usually talking about the works themselves. So when you're so you will usually use the present tense when discussing the works. So you would, for example, say, researchers discover that there is a discrepancy, or sorry, if you're talking about what the researchers did, again, researchers discovered in past studies, past tense, researchers discovered a discrepancy in A and B. That would be the past tense. That would be their actions, their methods and their results. If you're talking about the overall results that are sort of the product of a lot of research as a statement of fact, for example, Many studies show that this cancer is the most deadly. That's present tense. And then you can list the studies that supported that. But if you're pointing at a specific study, you can write in the past tense. So yeah, it's difficult to break this down into one rule. For other contexts and the statement of purpose and the approach, present tense is generally used, right? So when you see the purpose statement, it says this study describes, investigates, assesses. So it's the present tense is used. Should I use active or passive voice? Again, there's no hard and fast rule. The active is often preferable where it's possible, where the agent is more important than the action. But in science writing, in research writing, the action and what is done is often important. So you should really follow the standards of the target journal. And these are some common questions. If you have more, please write your questions to me now. Or you can always write, when we post this on YouTube, you can leave questions in the comment section, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. So feel free to hit us up there or on our website as well. Okay, so let's just look quickly at some do's and don'ts. Do use a lot of relevant sources. So as many sources as you can that are relevant. And your peers can help you decide how much is relevant and how much is too much. Brainstorm and pre-write the context before choosing which sources and information is most important. This means like when we discussed writing from the statement of purpose. So decide what the context is and write it all down, and from that you will choose a few that are the most important context for your study instead of using all of them. Use keywords from your title to focus on the exact problem addressed, right? Use the keywords to focus your study. Make sure to include a clear and concise purpose statement or hypothesis. Again, your purpose statement, hypothesis is the most important part of the introduction. It should be the clearest. And write it at the beginning of the final paragraph if you have a short enough introduction. Have a peer or an editing service look over your draft. So usually these services, Wordvice is a language editing service, but we do offer extensive comments on substance. We don't change your papers. But we can offer a lot of critical advice about the internal logic of the paper. And a peer, it might be the best idea to have a peer look at it first and then send it to an editing company such as Wordvice to get perfect grammar and more natural expression, especially if you're not a native English speaker. Okay, some things you do not want to do. So these are do not cite basic scientific knowledge or literature that is not closely related to your study. Do not forget to include citations. We see this quite often as editors that many authors who send us their manuscripts, or even if they're papers for a class, they've included the formatting style, but there's no citation, or the citations are not included in the right way. So you want to make sure that you cite the literature. You don't just make statements. Use as much relevant citations as possible when you make a statement in the introduction. Discuss methods or results in the introduction. Don't do that. Definitely don't discuss methods or results. You can hint at what the results, what you want as far as results, what you're trying to discover, but don't talk about the results. Write the introduction before the other sections. That should be after. That's my editing mistake. Excuse me. Write the introduction. That's right. Do not write it before. Right? Write the introduction after. We're confusing ourselves with negatives. And last, do not submit the first draft of your manuscript to journals. Instead, send it to us. We have, as I said earlier, we've edited millions of words for tens of thousands of authors who have been published in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of top journals. And so we can take care of any sort of documents from a few hundred words to many thousands of words. So yes, so I hope this has been informative about the introduction section. I don't see any questions, so I'm assuming because there's only 16 people on this webinar at this time, that nobody has any questions. But if you do, don't hesitate to contact us. Visit our resources page, and you can send, you can ask questions on YouTube as well. So since we don't have any questions, I think I'm going to wrap this up. So thank you very much, and please stay tuned for more Wordvice webinars. And if there's any topics that you would like to see discussed in the future, or if you have any feedback on this webinar, please leave a comment in the comment section, and that would help us out very much so we can help you. So thank you.